Loud, yes. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Segev Phillips. I'm the co-president of the middle school PTO, along with Brooke Bribriesco, and we have a number of other board members with us today. I wanted to first start the meeting by highlighting a few things. First, that obviously next year we will need to have a new board constituted. So if you're looking to be involved, if you have a 7th grader or you have a rising 7th grader next year and you want to be involved, we're always looking for more people to be involved in the various ways you can. Just look for those emails from our nominating committee and our PTO, and we'd love for you to get involved. Second thing is, if you haven't spoken to your children, at least the 8th graders, about service projects, they are working on those in schools. And in fact, the PTO has gotten at least one request to fund some things. And I highlight that mostly to say that what our 8th graders are doing and what our teachers are leading them through is really great. And I appreciate that. And lastly, for those with 8th graders, I wanted to highlight that the spring trip looks more and more likely to happen to DC, and that the PTO has been working very hard with the Shaker Schools Foundation, making sure that no child will not be able to go because of financial reasons. So if you've been holding off, please register your child. Please go through that process. Mr. Sears at the middle school is involved in organizing that and processing that, but we do have money available both at the PTO level and from the foundation, and we would hate for anybody to be left out because of financial reasons. So I urge you very strongly to go on this wonderful trip. With that, we are joined today by Dr. Glasner. I assume everybody knows that Dr. Glasner is the superintendent of our schools, and he's going to be speaking to us about the Forward Together process and planning. I have received a few questions from parents directly, so I'll moderate those. I'll also moderate the chat, and I also encourage, if anybody wants to speak, they are welcome to unmute themselves and ask questions. But I did ask Dr. Glasner in advance if he would keep the presentation portion of his presentation, I guess, of the meeting shorter so that we could have more time for questions, which I know a lot of you have. So, thank you.
Thank you, Segev. It is great to be here. And before I jump into Forward Together, I just wanted to echo everything Segev said about the DC trip. I know it's a great opportunity. Thank you to the PTO and of course the Shaker Schools Foundation for helping make that an opportunity that all of our students can experience. And it's exciting to see those kinds of experiences coming back. I wanted to just start with a quick show of hands because I want this to be helpful for everybody here. Can I just see a quick show of hands, either in person, so to speak, or virtually? You can raise your hand. If you've been to a presentation already, if you've been involved in a community engagement session. I know I see some familiar faces, but I'm just trying to get a sense of who here has already been to some of those sessions. I'm just waiting a minute just to see. All right, if you've been raising your hand, you can put it down. If you think it would be helpful to, or if you would like some additional information, kind of some level setting, have a status update, if you could raise your hand now, because I just want to try to get a sense of how many people need kind of a review of some of the basics. Again, that could be virtually or, all right. All right, well, it seems like the vast majority of people have seen or participated in presentation. So I'll keep this very brief. And really, I just want to talk about, I'm not going to talk about the concepts. I'm happy to go over those details if you want, but I do want to talk about the why and why we're doing this process right now, because I think it's really critical that we leave here this evening with that understanding. Courtney, I see your text. I'm happy to share some basics, so I will. I agree with Segev. I'm happy to have time for conversation and questions. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So Well, just to make sure we're all on the same page, I will share my screen if that's okay, just so we have something to look at. I promise not to do death by PowerPoints over here. Like I said, I just want to talk quickly about the why and why we're doing this. As you know, we're doing this in collaboration with the city and the library. We also have an objective in our own strategic plan to develop a facilities plan because we have never had a long-term facilities plan in our district. And it's important that the decisions that we make on a daily basis in terms of the maintenance we have to provide for our buildings to keep them standing, that we do that in the context of a long-term and strategic plan related to our facilities. There are some driving forces to doing this project now and to going through this planning process now. Most importantly, our students. And I know everybody here has students at the middle school. And I know that you know that they deserve an education and facilities that support an education that prepares them for the modern world. I was just talking to some middle school teachers yesterday who shared with me how important collaboration is in today's day and age. I mean, the community project that Sega referenced is a good example of that. And some of the struggles or challenges that our facilities present when we try to collaborate in our facilities. And that could be collaboration between students, could be collaboration with teachers. Many of our classrooms have more than one adult now in a classroom, at least part of the time. Students are working in individual settings, sometimes in small group settings, sometimes in whole group settings. And our facilities make that kind of collaboration and that kind of flexibility very challenging. If you visited the middle school, I am sure during the day, I'm sure you've seen students working on the radiators or the benches in the hallway. I know I've seen teachers who are there to provide support or enrichment have to pull students into difficult or challenging spaces to work. I was talking with some teachers yesterday about providing additional supports for students, like social and emotional supports and other kinds of interventions for students. And our spaces just don't facilitate those kinds of interventions or supports very easily. The modern world has changed all around us, and our buildings have not, in terms of who we access, what kind of information we access, when and how. And I think it's time our facilities change for that. We also need to spend our resources wisely. We spend a lot of money every year on our facilities. I know many of you supported a $30 million bond project 5 years ago to address urgent, warm, safe, and dry issues, like the major roof leaks we experienced at the middle school. It's important that we spend our money in ways that also have an impact, a positive impact on student learning experiences and outcomes. So I've been asked a lot, how will facilities change learning outcomes? I can't prove right now that we will see an increase in student achievement metrics, but I know there are a lot of factors that our buildings provide and shape that I believe will have a positive impact on learning outcomes and experiences. Like students having the time to collaborate with each other. One of actually the key factors in student learning outcomes is teachers having opportunities to collaborate with each other, and our facilities need to provide those kinds of opportunities. We also know it's important for students to feel welcome in our buildings, and that has an impact on student learning outcomes. I just heard from a family recently who's considering moving from out of the country to Shaker Heights for professional reasons. And they asked for a tour of our facilities to make a decision about whether to send their children here. I have to be honest with all of you. I don't think that our facilities are a showcase of what Shaker provides for students. They wanted actually to come see the middle school. And I thought to myself, is our middle school, the way it looks, is that really a selling point for families coming from out of the country to move to Shaker Heights? Now, don't get me wrong. And I know there are teachers on this call. Our teachers do an amazing job, and they do an especially amazing job given the challenges that we face, literally fighting our buildings. But I think our students and our families and our community deserve more. Lastly, I believe we have an opportunity, an exciting opportunity to shape the future of our community in alignment with our community values. And I'm just going to pause here for a minute because I know many of you have heard this presentation, but I'd like to hear from you why you live in Shaker Heights. You can popcorn it and you can talk just verbally if you want to unmute yourself, or put it in the chat. I'd love to hear from some folks why you live in Shaker Heights.
I'll jump in if you don't mind.
Go for it.
My name's Kevin Lowry. I am the Vice President of Teacher Education and Advocacy for the Middle School PTO. And my mother-in-law went to Shaker Heights Schools from K through 12. My wife went to Shaker Schools from K through 12. My daughter went to school from K through 12. And now I have an 8th grader there at Shaker. And we are there because we know that Shaker provides just as well of education as any of the schools in the Northeast Ohio when on the right track. And so we are in Shaker because not only we're in Shaker because we believe in the education system in Shaker.
Thanks, Kevin. I see Jill put in the chat also, strong sense of community. Other thoughts anybody else wants to share?
I'll jump in. We moved to Shaker because we like the diversity, both in people you meet, but also in architecture, and really like the community feel of each neighborhood. So one of my concerns, as you'll go on, is that that would be lost if you lose the neighborhood elementary schools.
Thank you. I see some other comments in the chat. I'll just highlight diverse community because of the quality of education and great sense of community and resources.
I'll jump in real quick too.
Sure.
Similar to what both of you have already said and what people have chatted, but now that I've had one graduate and I have a kid in almost every school, it's been really heartening to see how each of my kids and their personalities and learning styles have been met. I have a really creative child, and she was totally attended to and had a really amazing experience with that part. And then I have a son who's very math and AP, and so he's got opportunities that suit him. And then my other kids, I feel like, are being served as well in the lower grades. And I also really like, and I think this is a huge plus, is that all of my kids with these different personalities and learning styles, I feel like the whole child is being educated, and it's more than just the test. And they're all getting that with all these different programs that you've offered. So there's my 2 cents.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear, Carrie. If other folks have things they want to add in the chat, you're welcome to. I just wanted to pause to encourage everybody to share those stories and your experiences and your reasons for living in Shaker, because I believe that right now, as we think about the future of Shaker, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to shape the future of our facilities in line with what makes Shaker so special. That sense of community that many of you spoke about, some of that is tied to our neighborhood schools, and there are other ways that we build community here in our city and in our school district. Also, the idea of a diverse community. I know when I talk to families, that's something that comes up all the time. It's not just any community. Shaker is unique because we really value diversity. We really value equitable outcomes for our students. We really value inclusion. And the way we structure our facilities is an important part of that. This process has lifted up questions that we have to struggle with as a community around who has access to buildings, when and how, who has those neighborhood hubs in their communities? Who does not, as schools as neighborhood hubs? Who doesn't? And how do we build community when there aren't schools in neighborhoods? We also have to ask ourselves questions about belonging and how we address the difference between families that live around a school and families that don't live around a school, while still maintaining diversity and inclusion. And this is important for everybody. We know that our schools prepare students for the world they enter when they leave our schools. And we want our children to be prepared to work with people from different backgrounds, of different experiences, of different races, from different neighborhoods. Those are things we have to keep in mind. And lastly, and I know this is especially true for folks that have kids in middle school, our buildings are not inclusive from an ability or disability level. So our buildings are not ADA compliant. I was just talking to middle school teachers a couple of days ago who shared with me, if a student breaks a leg in the middle of the year, that student is going to be, their classes will have to be rescheduled to make sure they can go to the classes that are accessible, or their whole class might have to move. And we know that there are students who experience this permanently, not temporarily. So those are just some things to keep in mind as we think about our buildings. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Unless anybody has anything they want to jump in with, I will go back to quickly sharing my screen. So I'm not going to go through this line by line. These are some of the considerations that we are taking into account as we plan for the future of our facilities. I know many of you have heard about the different ideas that we have shared with our community so far. I will go through these quickly. I do want to just highlight that these are ideas, these are concepts. I am very confident that the final plan we end up with is very likely going to be different in some form or fashion from the concepts we are sharing today. These are meant to generate ideas, they're meant to generate discussion, they're meant to try to provide some answers to the questions that we've been raising as a community. So concept A is a more centralized concept. It includes one new elementary building for all K-5 students that would be located at the current middle school site. Boulevard and Mercer will be available for some type of reuse. Fernway and Lomont would be available for possible pre-K or offices. This concept includes a new 6 through 8 building at the current Onaway Woodbury site, a new high school at the current site, which would likely include the Innovative Center, a new indoor pool with some opportunities for shared use with our community. And we are talking with the city about moving our bus depot and bus garage. As many of you know, the city is in the process of a Lee Road development and visioning process. And part of that is thinking about other locations for our bus depot and garage. Concept B is more of a decentralized model, more similar to what we have now. In this concept, we would renovate or build a new Boulevard and Lomont and Mercer. Fernway would remain, all of those buildings would remain K-4 schools. This includes a new 5 through 8 building at the current Onaway Woodbury site. Also includes a new high school like Concept A, a new pool like Concept A, and relocating the bus depot and bus garage. Pre-K would be located in the K-4 building like it is now, similar to, right now it's located in Onaway, so we would determine where exactly it would be located as the process evolves. I know our focus tonight is on schools, but there are other assets we're talking about. We're not gonna be talking about them at length, but Thornton Park, the Stephanie Tubbs Jones building, and others are part of the larger Forward Together conversation we're having. I want to just spend a few minutes talking about costs and explain what this information means and why we're sharing it. So we have tried to develop some cost estimates to give you an idea of the kinds of investments that we would be making in our schools. And they're really important investments. Concept A, the cost estimate would be about $300 million. Concept B is a little different. You'll see there's a little bit of a difference if we renovate as compared to build new. The reason for that difference, when we talk about renovation, the reason for that difference, these are renovating our elementary schools. We try to develop cost estimates that are apples to apples comparisons. So renovating schools to the same standard as a new building. If we renovate our elementary school buildings, it would extend the timeline out, which extends the projected cost as well. You'll see we included the cost per student. This just gives us some helpful benchmarking data. Cleveland Heights, for example, recently went through a similar process. They wound up with a new or renovated high school and 2 new middle schools. They spent about $72,000 per student. Warrensville Heights is completing a similar process. They also spent about $72,000 per student. So you can see we're kind of in the ballpark of other similar projects. I want to be clear that this is not the amount of money that we would be asking our community to support in any kind of bond issue. We have other funding streams that are available to us that we would be taking advantage of that would be taking advantage of. One of the most important funding streams is state funding. We are currently eligible for 36% of co-funding for qualifying expenses. What that means is if the project cost $100 million, we would get approximately $36 million from the state. This is more money that we've ever been eligible for, and possibly more money, probably more money than we ever will be eligible for. Just to give you a sense, 5 years ago when we started this process, we were eligible for 23% of state funding. Cleveland Heights received about 14% of state funding. Not everything is eligible for state funding. Items like pools and auditoriums, we would have to fund as a community, but we certainly want to take advantage of this funding while we can. I just want to briefly talk about a projected timeline. You'll see Concept A is a little more compact. The reason for that, Concept A focuses on new buildings. New buildings, based on our current modeling, we believe we can build new buildings without having to use swing space. I mean, students would be in their current buildings while new buildings are being built. So it's a more consolidated or compact timeline. Concept B, it stretches out a little bit more because if we renovate elementary schools, we would need to use swing space. So students at Boulevard, for example, would go to another building while we renovate Boulevard, then they would come back, then we would switch to Mercer, they would go to a swing space, and then they would come back. So that's why that timeline is a little more extended. The last thing I want to mention before I stop, I know I shared this slide earlier. There are a number of different considerations that are going into the discussions and ideas that we're presenting. 2 things that I just want to highlight. I know many of you have talked about, and I've heard feedback around the historical character and nature of our buildings and how important that is. We know that it is important to maintain the beauty that we have in Shaker. We have created cost estimates that take that into account. We also know that it's important to think about what happens on the inside of our buildings. I know I was talking to a student a couple of days ago recently, and she said, you know, we as a community have a decision to make about whether we value the exterior of our buildings or whether we value what happens inside the buildings. We are able to create new buildings, new facilities that provide some of the modern supports for students while also maintaining the historical character and nature of our school. Lastly, I just want to highlight that we expect that we may have to or will have to consider reconfiguring school attendance zones in this process. Certainly that would be a part of Concept B. So I just wanted to make that clear that, you know, where students go to school now, not necessarily where they would go to school in the future. We want to make sure that we are clear about that. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I know I've done a lot of talking. I want to open up the floor. Segev, if you want to help moderate, I'm happy to answer questions that have come up either in the chat or that you've already kind of solicited.
Absolutely, and I encourage, by the way, everybody to add their questions now. I'm sure there are a lot. First question is, can you clarify the cost estimate for Concept B? Is this both new and renovated, i.e. a total of greater than 6 million? I'm not sure what that's referenced. Or if we renovate, does that include new school at Onaway Woodbury site?
Sure, and I'll go back to that slide just so I can reference it while we talk. So with Concept B, the costs, so if we were to build in Concept B, if we were to build a new high school, a new middle years school, and a new and then build new elementary buildings, those 3 new elementary buildings, then the cost estimate range is $296 to $350 million. If we were to renovate those spaces, and I believe that means renovating the elementary spaces, but still building the new bigger schools, the high school and the middle year school, then it would be a little more expensive, the $335 to $365 million. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not quite sure where the $6 million what that was referencing. Maybe it's related to the cost per student. I'm not sure. But that's now, of course, these are estimates. They're cost projections. We worked with architects, construction companies, and the state to develop these cost estimates to try to make them as accurate as possible with the information that we have.
Kevin, did you jump on because you have a question?
I do, because I have to leave shortly. Yes, I wanted to ask, I've gone to a number of the meetings pertaining to the facilities, and I always add that for at least 5 years now, we are one of the neighborhoods. I live in the Ludlow community, and we are one of the communities that lost our elementary school before I even got here. We've been in the city for 20 years. Our children went to Boulevard. And so what we've been trying to do is, I'm also the president of the Ludlow Community Association. And so what we have been trying to do is utilize the Ludlow School, which is now leased to PEP, to see if we could get the gym and the auditorium as a drop-in place for students in Shaker to have a gymnasium that they can utilize, as well as an auditorium that they can utilize for health and wellness, as well as educational things. And so have you guys thought about utilizing any other facilities for after school activities? Because we do not have a rec center, maybe we could still utilize some of the facilities for recreation for the students. Has that been a thought?
Thanks for asking the question, Kevin. The short answer is yes. And that's why it's so important that we are collaborating with the city and the library. Recreation spaces and facilities and ways that we can use facilities, either school facilities or city facilities, as hubs for the community, for youth, for senior citizens, for everybody in between, has certainly come up. I appreciate your suggestion around Ludlow and trying to use some of that facility as a gathering space or for recreation facilities. Obviously a lot depends on where things end up. So if we're not using the middle school site, for example, the city may is talking about, could that be a larger recreation facility? Could there be smaller recreation facilities in neighborhoods? Those are things that are definitely coming up. So,
okay.
And by the way, this process, this process and the process of thinking about how facilities should be repurposed, whether it's our school facilities or city facilities, there will be a lot of opportunities for input and engagement around those conversations.
Yes, and so I am reaching out to your assistant so that maybe we could have some of our Ludlow community meet with you to discuss the facilities. And so be looking out for us in the near future.
That would be fantastic, Kevin. I would be thrilled to do that.
No problem. Okay, guys, I have basketball with little Kevin. So have a good night. And thank you,
Thanks.
Dr. Glasner, for showing up.
Thank you, Kevin.
Dr. Glasner, the next question is related to Kevin's question. Could you please talk about if you feel it's important to place an elementary building near Moreland or Ludlow neighborhoods? Has it been considered at all? And give us an example of the rezoning possibilities and how it would affect these areas. I'll highlight that I actually asked you a similar question the other day, and I thought in terms of equity, that if we're going to close Onaway, perhaps rebuilding Ludlow and have Onaway parents sending their kids there might be an option, but if you could address that.
It's something that we're open to exploring. I want to a couple things. First of all, acknowledge, and I know a few folks already in this meeting have acknowledged that decisions made in the past took schools out of neighborhoods. As part of that, also maybe further marginalized parts of our community. And as partly as a result of those decisions, I mean, we're now in a community where the vast majority of students who are bused are Black students. So the question around Ludlow or Moreland is certainly an appropriate one. We want to balance the ability to move forward with a lens around diversity, equity, inclusion, while also recognizing that we have more facilities than we need right now. And part of this is thinking about spending and allocating our resources wisely. So it's something that we have to address, that we have too many school buildings, and having more school buildings, while might answer some of the issues that we face, might also doesn't address the full scope of what we need to do. So, I do know that outside of school buildings, I also encourage us as a community to think about other hubs and assets that we can use to create community for neighborhoods. I was just talking with a family recently who lives in the Sussex neighborhood who don't yet have students in the schools, and they were talking about all the ways that they, as a neighborhood and as a community, are intentional about they intentionally build community without a school in their neighborhood. I know that's also why the Lee Road project is so important and why we're working with the city to move our bus depot, because there are ways that we can bring communities together, even if we can't have schools in those neighborhoods.
Can you talk about, there's a question here, how can we be doing DEI work in the city without this being a driving force? Can you talk about the people who are doing DEI work specifically and their involvement with this process, if any?
Absolutely. I mean, at the leadership level, there are certainly, our community engagement leaders, obviously including myself, but also our members of our DEI office are working closely with DEI leaders, the city, and through the community to engage in this process. But I will say, what I appreciate about this question is that I ultimately believe that the work that we have to do extends far beyond the decisions that we're making around facilities. And what I mean by that is we know that we have a lot of work to do to build relationships with our entire community, and especially with members of our community that have been marginalized or that are underrepresented traditionally and historically. And I know that it's important that this process, while we're talking about facilities, has to be more about building relationships, listening to people, hearing what people need from our community as a whole and from our schools specifically. I know I've appreciated this opportunity to get to talk with different members of our community. I know Kevin just mentioned getting to talk with the Ludlow community, and I'm looking forward to that, or members of our Ludlow community. I really believe that the kind of effort and intensity that we're focusing on around the facilities decision, really it will and needs to extend far beyond that. And that's why we're committed to the Forward Together process, to continue building relationships, and specifically through a lens of DEI with our community.
Thank you. This question is from Beth Gillespie, and it kind of reflects the comment that Linda made about why she loves Shaker. I think she mentioned the architectural diversity. And so relatedly, for those of us who love the architecture around here, is it possible to keep a facade or portion of buildings similar to Cleveland Heights to merge old with new? Great
question. The short answer is yes. Obviously, the devil is in the details a little bit when we talk about what we're preserving and what we're not preserving. Cleveland Heights is a good example. They did, a great job of upgrading and updating their buildings. Like us with Fernway, they did experience some limitations as a result of that. So I'll use Fernway in this case as an example, but I know Cleveland Heights had to make some similar decisions. Because we renovated Fernway instead of built a new Fernway, there were some limitations we faced in terms of sticking with the existing footprint. For example, classrooms in Fernway still are, very much kind of in a traditional model of being in a row down a corridor or down a hallway. Cleveland Heights faced some similar challenges that they had to, or constraints that they had to face just to keep that kind of some of that facade and some of that footprint. There are ways, certainly that we certainly believe in continuing to honor that historical nature and character of the building, whether it's through renovation or by building new, but still maintaining some of those historical elements and the aesthetic that we know in Shaker. The cost estimates that we created, we included those extra costs in the cost estimates to kind of Shakerize, for lack of a better word, the new buildings or renovated buildings.
There's a couple of questions relating to busing. If we choose centralized concept A, how will the district be able to provide busing for all students when we struggle, to find enough bus drivers now? And then a related question about, has there been a cost estimate for that?
Great question. So first of all, I hope the bus driver shortage we're living in right now is not a permanent bus driver shortage. But we would do additional modeling around that to figure out the impact on transportation. We have not yet. I know I've gotten questions like, does this mean we will need to do more busing? It's actually, that's not 100% clear. For elementary students, more elementary students would certainly be eligible for being bused or will be bused. But we would likely be consolidating some of our other busing routes. So right now we bus separate routes to Woodbury and the middle school, for example, and some of that or all of that would be consolidated in the concept. So there may be ways we can pick up some efficiencies also, but we would be exploring that more in depth as the process evolves.
All right. There's a question about universal pre-K. So is the concept of universal pre-K possible in the near future? And we need to consider space for these students in our buildings as well.
Great question. And we are very much in support of universal pre-K. We originally, actually, when we started this process, we were hopeful that the federal government would be farther along in terms of supporting universal pre-K. Realize now that that's not yet happening. We are including in the current concepts, we are anticipating being able to expand our current pre-K program. So just to give you a sense of what that means, right now we have about 80 to 85 students in our pre-K program. We usually have a very long wait list. We hope to be able to expand that to somewhere in the vicinity of 120. Universal pre-K would mean 600 to 700 students most likely. We do, in both concepts, there are spaces that we could consider down the road for universal pre-K if and when it happens. Certainly, I encourage everybody here to advocate with the federal government to move that ahead. Without federal government support or state government support, we cannot fund universal pre-K on our own. But it's certainly an area that we're invested in and would like to see continue growing.
Can you discuss or share the cost of renovating current buildings in their current state? What would that look like? It would be helpful in this process to understand why we would choose to knock down buildings instead of preserving them. Many Shaker homeowners renovate our almost 100-year-old homes with care and recognize the importance of doing so for Shaker.
Thanks for that question. So the cost estimates that we included, that is renovating our current buildings in our current state. I get this question or comments a lot about, kind of the analogy between the homes people live in and the schools that we have. And I understand that analogy. And I want to kind of highlight or emphasize that there are some differences. The way education happens and the way our world operates is very, very different now than it was 100 years ago when our classrooms and our schools were built. And that has a different effect on our living. The way we live is pretty similar. So, we have a bedroom we sleep in, we have a dining room we eat in, we have a kitchen we prepare food in. Schools are very, very different, and education is very different. So I'll use libraries as an example. Actually, I'll share a picture of our high school library, just so everybody can see. So you'll see in the bottom left-hand corner right there, that's what our library looks like in our high school right now. These are other pictures from our high school. That's what our library looks like in our high school right now. The way students access information and what they do in spaces like libraries is it's dramatically different than now than it was 100 years ago. If you go to the new Shaker Main Library, you'll see that. But libraries now are spaces where students are able to innovate and have access to technology and collaborate. And that is spaces that are very flexible. The way students get information now is not often through books. So the reasons why libraries exist are very different. And so when we think of just renovating the spaces that we have, we also have to acknowledge that the ways we use spaces and the ways we need to support students in developing skills and in learning is very, very different now than it was 100 years ago. And so, yes, I know in Shaker Heights, we tend to renovate our old houses and make upgrades. Education is very different, and the needs of our students are very different now than they were when our schools were built 100 years ago.
There's a number of questions, and they all sort of relate to or maybe attack this idea of a centralized elementary school. And I'll note that especially the cost estimates for the centralized school are within $1 million or maybe $5 million of the cost estimates for the concept B for the new building. And so these questions are all essentially asked to justify what would make us go that way. So for example, the first question is, the declining student population and simultaneously a strong interest in having local schools, why not close Woodbury, expand elementary schools to K through 6, and open new schools in neighborhoods that lost their schools? Another one is, with the amount of behaviors and fighting that takes place in some of our schools, especially Woodbury, is there any concern about younger kids being exposed to that with concept A? And then a similar, I think a good survey question is, how many parents would have picked Shaker Schools if their kindergartner would be going to an elementary school K through 5 with 1,800 students? They're all those questions seem to be on a theme. So
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just jotting down some notes so I don't forget what you shared. So a couple of things. So what are some benefits to centralized school? And I share this, be fully transparent. There are benefits and merits to both concepts. That's why we share them. I want to share some, and there are benefits and drawbacks, obviously, to both concepts. Some of the benefits of centralized schools. First of all, the kinds of supports and enrichment opportunities and learning experiences that students can have in a centralized space is much more consistent. So, for example, right now, students who go to Onaway can participate in the Onaway Little Theater program. Students who go to Lomond or Fernway can participate in the El Sistema Orchestra program. But if I'm an Onaway student and I want to do orchestra, can't really do that. If I'm a Fernway student and I want to do theater, can't really do that. So there is an opportunity to provide kind of a universal set of experiences and opportunities for students in a centralized building. Also, the kinds of supports that students have. For example, right now we split supports between buildings. Some of our buildings, Lomond, for example, has a school counselor. None of our other elementary schools do. We have social workers in elementary schools, and we have to split their time. So we have social workers, spend Monday, Wednesday, Friday in one building, Tuesday, Thursday in another building. Well, what happens if a student that the social worker typically works with on a Monday has a crisis or needs help on a Tuesday? So there are opportunities to provide more cohesive, comprehensive, consistent supports for students. I also want to highlight that the elementary experience is very different than a secondary building, and I would include Woodbury in that secondary building student experience. And I know, I mean, this is hard for me. I envision a large elementary school and I think automatically of a high school where students are, you know, going to different classes throughout the day, going to different parts of the building throughout the day. In an elementary school setting, a student is typically in one place or largely one place throughout the school day, surrounded by the same students, by the same teachers throughout the school day. And so a student's experience at the elementary level is still in a very confined space. It's still in a very small space, even if there's a larger building. And there are things that we can do intentionally to make sure that students are still able to build close relationships with other students, with families, with their faculty and staff that surround them. Many of the larger elementary schools are designed in wings, so that students have in wings with hubs, so that students are really in the same centralized location throughout the school day. A couple of other things I want to highlight, and I know I saw somebody mention this in the chat earlier. You know, there are families and students that do not have schools in their neighborhoods now, and there are intentional ways that we can still build and will build community in a centralized space. You know, the kinds of programming activities, we have a, you know, the Pumpkin Fest or other things like that that help build community, we can still do with smaller groups of students in larger buildings, smaller groups of students and families. The other thing I want to just mention, you know, right now, you know, students are with students from their neighborhood or from specific neighborhoods in their elementary schools. In a centralized building, students would start getting to meet and build relationships with students from all over our community, starting at an early age. And to me, that's really exciting. I mean, I think that's something we value as a community, that we get to interact with people from all over our city, all over our community. And there's an opportunity in a centralized space to be able to do that. So those are just some thoughts. And Segev, if I missed any kind of specific comments or question related to that, feel free to give me a nudge.
Is there a concern that putting young kids in schools where there's, or close to, well, hold on, let me confirm that the question, I'm asking the question right. The amount of behaviors and fighting that takes place in some of our schools, is there any concern about younger kids being exposed to that with concept A?
You know, I mean, I think that goes back to, I mean, an elementary student's experience is very different than a secondary student's experience. They're really, you know, in a pretty localized place throughout the day. I also think that that question speaks to the need for the kinds of social and emotional supports. I mean, we're already providing a lot, and, you know, there are some benefits in a centralized space to be able to provide even more of that. You know, why do students act out? Typically because there are underlying issues that they need support with, that they need assistance with, that need to be addressed. And, you know, obviously in any of these concepts, those are things that we're committed to continuing to work with to provide support for our students and their families.
Recognizing that the feedback is never going to be universal on one side or the other, do you have a sense for a theme about the feedback you're getting? I mean, I've been in 3 or 4 of these meetings. I think many of them take on this tone of keeping local schools, the neighborhood schools, as much as possible. Is that what you've noticed as well?
You know, I've actually really experienced a pretty broad diversity of thought. I know in some of our bigger sessions, and I know some of those, Segev, you've been in, the loudest voices have been around keeping neighborhood schools. Frankly and honestly, with everybody here, I've been in quite a number of community conversations where that has not been the case. And there's been, you know, kind of pretty broad support for both of these concepts. The one thing I will say that has been a theme and kind of a growing theme is the understanding that we need to do something. That doing nothing is not an option, that doing nothing doesn't answer the questions that we face as a community. I do think it's really important that, I mean, I know I'm hearing some of those different perspectives. I also think it's important, and I kind of encourage everybody here on this call to try to find opportunities to hear different thoughts and ideas from different community members, and also to kind of approach those conversations with the understanding that both approaches have value and merit. Yeah, there you go.
This is a question I got directly. They'd like to know about timeline. When would construction begin? I saw that it just has years, like year 1, year 2. But when would that mean? Are there repairs to the current schools that need attention soon? And how can we avoid another middle school mistake? It's the newest building, but the one I think no resident would be sad to see torn down.
Just in terms of timeline, I mean, we're aiming for a possible November ballot issue. Recognize that that's not possible, then our backup kind of plan B is to go possibly for a ballot issue in May. If we get feedback and we need to adjust that timeline, we will. Given that timeline, I mean, the earliest construction could begin would be sometime in the fall of 2023, and this is kind of the most ambitious of that timeline. So then you can kind of work backwards. It would take about 2 years from that point. So the earliest new buildings could be ready is 2025. We do have ongoing maintenance needs that we're faced with every day. I mean, we have probably over $1 million of roof repair work that we're going to need to do soon. And we've put in quite a bit of funding into some foundation and waterproofing work that we expect is going to continue to need to be done. We estimate that we spend about $5 million a year maintaining our current buildings. And I don't want to make the point, like, this isn't an argument that if we get new buildings, we won't have any maintenance needs. If we get new buildings, we'll still have maintenance needs, but at least we'll have new buildings, or at least we'll have renovated buildings. I mean, buildings that have an impact on the student learning experiences and staff and faculty teaching experiences. I think there was a part of that question that I missed though. So the last part of the question was...
Yeah, I think it's related to sort of building quality, and a lot of people voice this, right? They don't build them like they used to. So the question is, if the middle school is the newest building, but it's arguably in worse shape, how do we avoid that happening again?
So yeah, no, I think about that a lot. I don't want anybody 50 years from now going and looking back like, hey, they thought this was a great new building and it was like a terrible design idea. I think we're fortunate. We're certainly not the first ones going down this path. And so we have other school buildings and districts that we can learn from. I know that we had some of our leaders and planners attend a school facility conference recently and got to hear from other school districts that have already put in place some of the modern educational facilities. And so we've learned from them, and there are lots of things that work and some things that we know we need to avoid. But I don't think by the time we're ready to break ground and build new, some of these ideas aren't quite as new. So we're able to learn from other districts who have already implemented these things.
Okay, I'm going to kick it over to Ramona. Ramona, I'm sorry, the chat box was covering yours, so I didn't see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't feel like typing. But so very quickly, one, I have been involved with the Forward Together committee. So I would just encourage people to participate in some of the meetings that they're having. And if you're unable to attend the meetings, to complete the surveys, because that's where you're allowed to provide your input. Secondly, I would encourage people to visit some of the schools that have built new. I was very adamant on the architecture of our schools until I was at Garrett Morgan, Cleveland Public School last Saturday. And as Dr. Glasner said, just seeing that whole school, it was just very impressive, and we are very limited. So I would just encourage people, before you make a decision, and cast your vote. If you would take the time, if you have it, to visit any of these schools that have built from ground up. Thirdly, to Dr. Glasner, because you keep referencing, which I totally agree with, that the concept of these buildings are 100 years old and just the space in there. And so I hope that you guys are also addressing some of our techniques. And so I won't go into this, Glasner, but this is a follow-up to that email that I sent you. Okay, and so in addition to our buildings, I think some of the practices that we're doing on education wise, and I'm sure they're being addressed, but I'm just gonna keep that out there, that they definitely need to be addressed. Some people had it in there about Woodbury, but not getting so off topic, but I just learned about some very disheartening data with the suspension rate of African-American males in the schools. So as you're changing the schools and the look of it, we also have to get to the inside of what's going on in the buildings. And it's always interesting, and I get it for everybody, well, not everybody, but many people saying they don't want to lose the buildings in their neighborhood. But it's sad, although that was before any of our time, to see the buildings that were lost and what neighborhoods they were in. Because I grew up in the Moreland neighborhood, so we didn't have a say then. We lost our school. Now I live in Ludlow, didn't have a say. We lost our school. And so I am glad at least that the community is doing that engagement piece now with this process where we will have a say. So that was too much to type. So thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. I very, very much agree that what happens inside our buildings is ultimately a lot more important than what our buildings look like on the outside. We are doing a lot of work to address the kinds of concerns that you just raised. I also believe that we shouldn't be fighting our buildings to do that. But I 100% agree on new or renovated buildings will only get us so far. It's what happens inside the buildings, the relationships that we build with students, the supports that we provide, the work we do with families, and the kinds of education, instructional and curricular experiences that students have. That ultimately is way more important. So thank you for bringing that up.
Perhaps you could address this concern. It seems to me the poster says that the challenges are due to staffing shortages and misalignment. Smaller classrooms and support staff would seem more critical to address before new buildings. And there was a related question somebody sent to me, which was how our schools are funded. Do they come from different pots? So is money we spend on our buildings not money that we would be able to allocate to, for example, hiring more teachers?
So good questions. So let me just say, first of all, I mean, the question about, smaller class sizes and more student supports. I mean, we have that conversation concurrently in conjunction with the conversations we're having around facilities. I want to be clear here in Shaker, we do have, we're very fortunate. Our class sizes are pretty small. We've built into our cost estimates the expectation that class sizes would still remain smaller than the state standard. We also have lots of student supports, not to say that we don't need more, but that, I mean, we've actually invested quite a bit over the past few years. We have new literacy intervention specialists, we have more social workers, we have a school counselor. So there are lots of supports that we're providing already, and we need to provide more that can still happen in conjunction with and in addition to the facility planning process. The last part of that question, Segev, sorry, my mind just slipped. Can you remind me?
I'm sorry, I was muted. How does school funding work? Is
Oh,
it
right.
different buckets?
Yeah, so right now, I mean, when we have these kinds of significant capital costs, like having to do millions of dollars worth of roof repair work, that comes out of our operating fund. It comes out of our general operating fund. So it is a drain on our resources that otherwise could be going or would be going into the classroom, or at the very least should be going into improvements in the student learning experience. When we spend money like that just on roofs, we either end up having to go out for an operating levy sooner than we otherwise would have, or we have to go out for another bond issue. So like, imagine if we don't do anything now, let's say in about 7 or 8 years, we would likely have to go out for another capital bond project just to address those short-term warm, safe, and dry kinds of projects. Or we'd have to go out for more frequent operating levies. We're in a place right now, it's been about 8 years since we last went for an operating levy. I think we've been good fiscal stewards, but we will eventually have to go back to our community for support just for the day-to-day operations. The way that a building project like the one we're describing tonight is funded is very different than just a regular kind of the regular levies that we ask our community to support. I'm not a financial expert when it comes to this, but the way that we structure those kinds of bonds is very different. It's a 30-year term, kind of like a mortgage, and we can spend it only on capital improvements, and we get state funding for it.
You mentioned that the goal is not to displace students during construction, specifically for the high school, since all current middle school students would be in the high school at some point during the construction of a new school if timeline is maintained. How will that work? Will they stay in the current high school building?
Good question. So our goal is to try to limit or avoid displacement when possible. Based on our current modeling, we believe that we could build a new high school by the kind of behind the football field. So students would attend the current high school while that new building is being built. Once that new building is finished, the students would go from the old high school to the new high school. At that point, we would demolish the old high school and build green space, replace those athletic fields, add some parking in, those kinds of things. But right now, based on our current modeling, we'll be able to build new while the buildings stay standing.
Yeah. Beth, I see you have a related question. Do you want me to? Okay.
I think just it's for all the other schools, not just the high school, that we're making sure that we're not, impeding student learning while we're doing all this renovating or building new buildings. So I guess if you could just address the other schools too, that would be great.
Sure. So again, based on our current modeling, we generally believe we could build new while students remain in the current building, so we wouldn't have to put them into swing space. If we renovate, so I'll use Boulevard as an example. If we were to renovate Boulevard, students from Boulevard would have to go to a swing space, which likely would be the middle school. While Boulevard is being renovated, they would then go from the middle school back to Boulevard, and then we'd go to Mercer. Mercer students would go to the middle school while we renovate Mercer. We've kind of sequenced it out to work, but it would cause, depending on which building we renovate when, there would be disruptions to a student's academic career, while we were doing some of that work.
And then like the athletic spaces and stuff would be maintained. I guess that's not, this building would go on the far side and like the high school.
Good question. Depends, and to an extent. So like in the example I gave with the high school, we would be using up, I think it's the baseball field to build that new high school. So, we've already been communicating with the athletic director, and this is not unusual for school districts who are doing this kind of work. We would have to find some alternate sites for athletic games or practices. Based on our current modeling, we think our football stadium we'd probably be able to keep intact. So track and football and other sports that use that, but some other sports may not. But kind of depends again on which site we're talking about and which concept. But that's something that we.
Is Ludlow able to be used as a swing space?
Well, right now there is an educational program in there. The PEP program is in there, so we'd have to kick them out. Possibly. It would still be a swing space. It's not clear we would need it, Like it wouldn't necessarily advance the timeline any more than we already are able to. But it's certainly something.
Has there been discussion about increased parking around the high school? Oh, during construction?
Obviously, there would be some disruptions to traffic flow and parking during construction. We would work to do our best to address those. I know we've had some recent experience around parking issues with Fernway being rebuilt. We would work with the city and others to address those during construction. Now, also following construction, one of the things that we'd like to address if we move forward with the new high school is also addressing some of the parking congestion that exists in this space right now. So that's something that we would also work with our planners on.
Out of curiosity, if the plan that ultimately is approved is a, say, $300 million plan, do you have a sense? I know OFCC will cover some of that. I know we can borrow some off future operating costs. Do you have a sense for how big a levy will actually be asked to approve? Will it be 200 million?
I don't know offhand. I mean, those are calculations that we're in the midst of trying to model. I will say, and I know this goes without saying, we will do everything we can other than a bond issue. So there are other funding mechanisms that we have because we know that our community already shoulders a heavy burden when it comes to supporting our schools. So we'll do everything we can to reduce that bond issue to the lowest extent possible. But I don't have the numbers yet.
Okay. Can we, the response to the earlier question about using Ludlow as a swing spaces, can we use Ludlow as a school for Ludlow?
Possibly. I mean, it's something that we're looking at. I want to kind of go back to the idea that we're balancing the desires for the future of our schools while also recognizing that we have to reduce our footprint, our facilities footprint. So if the question is, can we use Ludlow as a school for Ludlow in addition to all the other schools that we currently have? That answer is probably not. We're looking to see if we can look at Ludlow as a possible elementary school, but it would possibly mean taking other elementary schools offline, to not have those schools in neighborhoods. So it does kind of go a little bit hand in hand with this idea of reconfiguring attendance zones. Where families currently go to school may not be where they go to school in the future.
And I don't see any questions.
Sorry.
I don't see any questions I haven't addressed. So if anybody wants to speak, I do have one last question for myself, which is, can you discuss sort of who is actually has to approve this? If people don't feel like the Forward Together survey is sufficient, should they reach out to their city councilman? Should they reach out to you? What's the?
Great question. So I'll give you the kind of technical answer to who is going to be approving what down the road, and then I'll also answer that second part. So specifically for the schools, our school board has to approve a master facilities plan. The state requires it. Once the school board approves a master facilities plan, then we're able to go on the ballot for a bond issue. We are obviously working in collaboration with the city and the library and our community at large to get input. But ultimately, who is making this decision, who is approving the facilities plan, it is the school board. If anybody here wants to provide more input, you're welcome to reach out to me. We're obviously in close communication and collaboration with leaders at the city and the library, so you're also welcome to reach out to them. I know some folks here have been in some of these meetings, an ask is if you have friends, family, neighbors that you think would benefit from having smaller group conversations as a way to provide input, that's certainly something that we're open to and eager to engage our community.
There's a great question in the chat, very thoughtful. Would it cut out any areas if rezoning happens? I think specifically, what about those who border Cleveland or are in Cleveland, but Shaker Schools, are they in jeopardy?
No, it would not cut out any areas. Like I said, there may be adjustments in which schools students go to, but no, we would not be cutting out any of our school district areas.
Would the levy and funding for the rec centers and stuff be a separate bond issue? Is that
It could be. I mean, it's not something that the schools would be issuing. I really believe that that process will unfold over a longer period of time. And I know talking with the mayor, you know, he expects that, because there are lots of decisions and questions that the city has. You know, for us, it's kind of a more discrete kind of, we have these school buildings, we have to decide what to do with them. With the rec centers and the recreation spaces, there are a lot more questions, discussions that have to happen, and funding is also, you know, their state funding isn't provided for that. So how we as a community, how the city would fund those kinds of spaces is something that will be discussed and researched at more length. And of course, I'm not an expert in those, but I know those conversations are already starting.
all right? I see no questions. I wanted to thank you. I wanted to highlight what Ramona said earlier, which is everyone, please go fill out the surveys. Dr. Glasner, any last words?
No, just, I mean, definitely fill out the survey. The website, I think you're all aware of, but I'll just put a brief plug in, forwardtogethershaker.com. If you go to the website, scroll about a quarter of the way down, you'll see a link to provide input. Encourage everybody to do that. And as always, you're always welcome. Thank you for putting the link in the chat, Courtney. Always welcome to reach out to me if there's anything else you want to share or add. But thank you very much for inviting me. Really appreciate it. And I see Ms. Hughes has been in the call, so I just want to acknowledge. Thank you, Ms. Hughes, and the other staff members who have been a part of this conversation. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Bye.
for your time.